dear Glenn. Thank you, dear and respected co-travelers in our journey in not only talking about integral consciousness, but cultivating integral consciousness. So with deep gratitude to friends who have held our hands in this journey, I wish to offer my offering with the title, Cultivating Integral Consciousness and a New Yoga and Tantra of Integral Development. Sri Aurobindo, Mahatma Gandhi, Tyler de Seda, Jean Gebser, and the challenges of evolutionary flourishing and planetary realizations. Evolutionary flourishing is a link here to integral consciousness as a companion of the evolutionary striving, evolutionary adventure, and linking it to the current discourse of development as sustainable development, which unfortunately has a danger of being imprisoned within status quo. We need to transform sustainable development to evolutionary flourishing. Integral consciousness challenges us to work and meditate with dualisms and dualities of many kinds and move towards evolving non-dual realizations in thought, practice, relationships, and consciousness. We need to explore the challenge of integral consciousness in the field of discourses and practices of human and social development, including the challenges of economic development and political empowerment. I explore how integral consciousness challenges us for a new yoga and tantra of integral development, building on Sri Aurobindo Yoga Sutra, Gandhi's Anasakti yoga. Anasakti yoga means the yoga of non-attachment. And we see that how important it is to develop a yoga of non-attachment vis-a-vis our imprisoned temporality. And how with Gebser, it is important to free ourselves from the prisons and prisms of temporality and what I call as cultivating, linking this to the vision of Jean Gebser, it is a yoga and tantra of aperspectivality, cultivating aperspectival consciousness and modes of being. And here we must also invite ourselves to that this much celebrated theme of the aperspectival, in terms of cultivating the aperspectival, we can draw on traditions of yoga and also tantra. And later on, I would see that how in modalities of tantra, for example, Kali, Mother Kali, the image of Mother Kali as the devourer of time, a kind of a superficial temporality which imprisons us and frees us to embody this multiple temporality. And therefore, a sadhana of Tantra can help us in our journey of a new temporality. I connect Sri Aurobindo and Gandhi's yoga and Tantra of Advaita, non-dual, to Gebser's way of the aperspectival. I especially discuss how a new yoga and Tantra of development involves a new yoga and tantra of time, what I call a new yoga and tantra of pregnant temporality, which becomes a way of relating to Gebser's ever-present origin. We also can relate this to critical philosopher Michael Foucault's way of critical ontology of the present, where our engagement with the contemporary is accompanied by the critical ontology of the present, which means that we are not prisoners of the dominant ontology. Like many of us, we have expressed unease with the dominant constructions of the present, either as neoliberal global capitalism or the kind of political fundamentalism, which seems to be totalizingly defining our present. But a critical ontology of the present is a questioning of this totalizing construction of the present and see multiple streams of alternative, not only towards the future, alternatives within and across the present. And as we are talking about time, we can also relate to what Glenn writes in his book, Original Thinking, and he has a very interesting thought here where he writes that Little Bear, the grandfather Little Bear, part of the conversation, began a dialogue on time and origin one year with a provocative statement: I am time, I equals time. And this new yoga of temporality, also facilitated by what Glenn continues to write in the following paragraph. We begin to believe that we could harness, even defy nature's rhythms for ourselves and control our future through willful human acts. This was the beginning of a separation of our consciousness from nature, which culminated in the reification of linear perspective in art. Perspective perhaps portrays time in terms of slight lines projected away from a stationary single eye towards the future. And this is a very important sentence in where poetry, philosophy, and spiritual challenge comes together. And it goes like this. This is both the I, EYE equals time, and I equals time. Because the conditions were created for the egoistic perspective to supplant nature's rhythm. Time became an abstraction, and abstract time allowed us to imagine that we did not need to adapt to nature anymore. So this yoga of temporality here also, this I am time, but this I is not the egoistic I. But what is that I? And as our dear friend Vladimir brought us the love of Krishna in many of his meditations here, in Bhagavad Gita, in Vishwarupa Yadarsana Yoga, Lord Krishna has a very beautiful invitation for us to realize vis-a-vis time. Kalosmi, I am time. And what is that? And therefore, this challenge of integrality vis-a-vis time, I am time, is an invitation for us, not only a kind of epistemic construction, but it is a multidimensional embodiment of temporality. And that requires a realization of time as pregnant time. And with respect, what we are invited to do, our relationship with pregnant time, also a humble journey of impregnation. That means, how do we impregnate time with our creativity, co-creativity? Because this co-creativity is not just human creativity, both the nature and the divine are co-creating in terms of both our embodiment of time and co-creating time. With this linked reflection, integral development is a concrete manifestation of integral consciousness, which resonates with Gebser's spirit. Spiritual reality in its intensified form is also becoming effectual and real. It is also yoga and Teilhard's vision of omega point, where we practice a new yoga and tantra of and with omega point as our ever-present origin. Integral development points to the need for new vision, practices of development, working, and meditating with many fragmentary conceptions and practices of development. Integral development calls for both material and spiritual development with a mutual critique and transformation of both the discourse and practice of material and spiritual as they are conventionally understood and constituted. And we know one of the epochal challenge of humanity, which has got heightened in modernity, is the dualism, unnecessary dualism between matter and spirit. And all our four co-travelers here, they have questioned that in their own way. Sri Aurobindo, the mother, and Gebser, Jung, and also Teilhard de Seda. Integral development calls for a new realization of a new language and meaning of life, which touches both the spiritual and pragmatic dimensions of language, self, culture, society, and development. And our work with, or what I would like to call as our sadhana with language, is very fundamental here. because our available language is inadequate to even talk about the process that we are in or we are invited to be in. Therefore, last evening, when Devasis was reading Gebser's as a phenomenology of spirit, it is in that sense, and Sri Aurobindo's invitations of the symbolic, not as much as representative, but as a direct perception of the emergent. And here we can invite ourselves to Sri Aurobindo's meditations or language, especially origins of Aryan speech, where we have forgotten that primordial reality of the language as having power to be able to give us a new experience of reality. Further elaboration of a new yoga from Sri Aurobindo's path of, as we know, Sri Aurobindo offers a fivefold reality of self and society: physical, vital, mental, psychic, and spiritual. And the challenge before us is, how can we bring, for example, what would be a physical yoga in the field of development? We know, as our respected friend, Angela was presenting as a physical education teacher, like body. But and how do we bring the development of body as part of human development and development of society? For example, in modernity, our conceptions of and relationship with the body are very much structured by mind-body dualism. Yoga of body and with body overcomes this dualism and realizes the beauty and dignity of the body and its relationship with mind, spirit, vital, and the psyche. Similarly, the yoga of and with the vital helps us cultivate our vital emotions, such as love, sex, and others. Yoga of the vital involves education of the vital. And today, what we find in our political life today, when there is so much of uncontrolled emotions at work, causing great danger, with respect, like, from the challenge from Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky to the contemporary political challenge of emotions, anger, and just scolding, and just outright scolding, And here Martha Nussbaum also wrote a very important work on political emotions, building on the work of Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr., how they cultivated political emotions in a different way. My submission is that the yoga of the vital is related to these kind of contemporary challenges of working with our emotions, educations of emotions. Similarly, in terms of our mind, yoga of the mind helps us develop our intellect and not to misuse and abuse it for narrow, selfish, and destructive ends. Similarly, we also can have yoga with the spirit. As Sri Aurobindo invites us to realize, the highest term of evolution is the spirit in which knowledge, love, and action, the threefold dharma of humanity, find their fulfillment and end. Here we must not forget to make the link to Hegel in that sense. Spiritual is a dimension of the spirit working in our lives, and yoga of and with spirit makes us spirit-filled and ready to receive the evolving gift of the spirit beyond the teleological logic of state, as it happens in Hegel's conception of state, spirit, and history. And that is so significant because, as Devasis says, that the whole, not only the curve of reason, but what can be called as the cunning of reason is related to this kind of teleology, where spirit and this state become coterminous and creating so much of state-led violence, And for our own meditation, we must not forget the kind of the death of the human is not just the product of two wars in 20th century. The death of the human is related to our 600 years of killing of the innocent people, including the colonization of this land. And therefore, our sense of, disgust today needs to be broadened beyond the teleology of the modernistic logic of state and colonialism. So yoga of the spirit invites us to identify with the pain and suffering of not only the concentration camp, but when the children here were brought to the mission schools, and I was there listening to a person, and she said that if you speak your mother language the third time, your tongue was cut down. So where is the challenge for feeling the sense of disgust and the yoga of the spirit in our ever-widening challenge of responsibilities? All these yogas contributes to self and social development. Social development has been conceived and applied mainly in terms of rights and justice. It has also been thought in terms of achieving economic development and political empowerment. Time being short, and I'm abbreviating this argument by saying that all these fivefold yoga, we can bring it to the field of the economy. For example, and today these are processes happening, how our body needs to be much more relaxed and integral rather than continues to be suppressed by the contemporary economic logic. Yoga of the spirit in economic development help us to realize spirit in our work in the field of the economy, so that we use economic development for the realization of the potential of all of us, and not just for profit maximization of only a few, as it is the case today, leading to extreme and killing economic and social inequalities. As, for example, challenged to us by Thomas Piketty, who wrote almost 10 years ago a book called Capital in 21st Century. And economists in this country, right from Jeffrey Sachs to others, they are challenging us not to forget the challenge of economic inequality today in America, India, everywhere. The same five yogas also help us in the vision and practice of political empowerment. For example, yoga of the body in political empowerment leads to a realization of the dignity of the body, going beyond the body as a symbol of political and social humiliation. Similarly, as I have suggested, yoga of the vital helps us with our gunas, for example, sattva, raja, tama, and develop our emotions. Yoga of the vital in the political fields helps us develop creative, nurturing, and nourishing political emotions such as love, empathy, compassion, and karuna in place of hatred, which is a process. Now, how do we create this process in the circles of political development? It also helps us to develop what William Connolly calls appropriate neuropolitics, going beyond the dualism between left and right in our cognition and consciousness in our brain. The left side, this morning we had heard about the inadequacy of the language of the left and right. So the left side is usually associated with rational thinking and calculation, the right side with empathy. Yoga of the mind in political development helps us bring reason and emotions together. Yoga of the spirit in political empowerment makes striving for political empowerment as a process of realization of the spirit. Moving on, I want to relate this yoga of development to the fundamental challenge of modernity. And not only the contemporary moment is a moment of the so-called end of curve of reason, but what is the relationship between reason and power? Do we see the transformation, accompanying transformation from the end, the so-called end of curve of reason, by the transformation of the logic of power? Not necessarily. So I bring us to the problematic that the very notion of development in modernity is based on our being imprisoned in an enlightenment black box where we are away from nature and transcendence. Therefore, today, yoga of development is a yoga with nature and also with transcendence. As we are talking also about Carl Gustav Jung, I wish to bring this to your attention from this writer, J.J. Clark, in his book, Jung and the Eastern Thought, a dialogue with the Orient. He writes, on a more personal level, Jung was by nature something of a Taoist. This can be seen in the strong bond he felt with the natural world, expressed in his love of water, of stones, and of mountains. And the last paragraph of his autobiography, he writes, all, and he quoted Lao Tse saying, all are clear, I alone am clouded, a remark which reflects to the importance of Taoist thinking. And we can look at Taoism as a very primordial yoga with nature, about transcendence, and that how today we need to do yoga with transcendence in its many sense. And here we also can remember Jung's journey with transcendence. And a scholar, recent scholar, in his article, Jung on Transcendence, he meditates on the very important essay by Jung on the transcendental function. And he invites us to realize that our journey with transcendence today has at least 4 dimensions: ontological, epistemological, phenomenological, and spiritual. Then this writer goes on to write, the process of pursuit of transcendence may seem as an axiological idea, perhaps even a pragmatic exemplar of symbol of highest values, where there is where opposition is breached, submerged, and transcendence in actuality. At the very least, when the transcendent function is successful, it may serve as a quasi-psychological solution to the mutually conflicting existence of opposite seeking dominance and all these repressions and others. So moving quickly forward to Tantra, and because of the lack of time, I do not elaborate Gandhi's Anasakti yoga, where he builds on Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. You know Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, Yama and Niyama, and he has offered us Ekadasa Brata, Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, Asangraha, Sarira Shrama, Aswada, Sarvatra Bhyabhavarjana, Sarvatra Bhayavarjana means fearlessness, and all these are very important part of the journey. But one important thing here is with Gandhi, and I think this is the normative ideal with all our thinkers, is how do we cultivate living and active non-violence, in the midst of many dark forces that we are in the midst of. With Sri Aurobindo, yoga of development has 2 further challenges. One is, again, time being short, I invite us that how the yoga of development is a yoga of development of the individual and the collective. Because Sri Aurobindo says at the present stage of evolution, both of them are imprisoned in such a way that they do not realize their spontaneous relationship. Secondly, since we have spoken a lot about subjectivism, the yoga of development from Sri Aurobindo is a yoga of the subjective, but it is also a yoga of the objective. And this I want to bring it into your consideration, which has not received enough attention so far. Developing the subjective dimension of life does not take away from us the responsibility of developing the objective dimension of life, science, self, and society, as Sri Aurobindo himself says. But still there is the question of truth of the self, what it is, where it is, real abiding place, and here subjectivism has to deal with the same factors as the objective view of life and existence. Therefore, how do we cultivate a different subjective, which is not egotistic, and different objective, which is not just a reproduction of the logic of power as truth? But that does not mean that we are absolved of the responsibility of journey with varieties of truth, both in the capital and the small sense. Moving on, in the next 2 minutes or so, I bring to Tantra of development, and we must not forget that how Tantra is very important in Sri Aurobindo's way of synthesis of yoga. And he writes about it, and the implication of that for the contemporary challenge, as we saw, from the presentation of Dave, that how the contemporary moment is a challenge of misogyny. But that misogyny has to be understood in a long-term cycle. what I call that misogyny is related to the long-term cycle of the axial age civilization, where the celebrated axial age, the rise of world religions, from Judaism to Confucianism, all these axial age religions are predicated on the dominant priest, and this is not innocent. It is predicated on the visible and the invisible killing of mother goddesses. So Tantra here invites us to realize that primal significance of mother, and therefore, how do we bring that work of mothering? And I also bring the challenge of a new Kundalini of development, focusing on developing our Kundalini power in self, society, and nature. And very interesting reflections on Tantra by scholars and friends like Nila Bhattacharya Saxena, my friend Marcus Bushi from Australia in an essay called Tantra as an Episteme, Sthaneswar Tamalsina, a philosopher and Tantra master, also writes some of the most salient features of Tantric discourse include the concept that the world is directly linked with the human body and that both are composed of the same cosmic energy. So building on this, finally, I wish to submit that integral development calls for developing inner and relational dimensions of self, society, and the world. Dominant discourses of development continue the secular assumptions of Euro-American modernity, and yoga and tantra development helps us to go beyond it and discover the spiritual streams of development. It challenges us to draw on both science and spirituality, religion and science, as it also challenges us to understand the limits and limitations of existing conceptions and organizations of science, religion, spirituality, and development. It joins in the post-religious critique and transformation of the religious, as it helps us in post-positivist critique of positivism and scientificism, and evolving spiritual critique of formulaic spirituality, post-secular critiques of secularism, and post-developmental critique and transformation of development itself. So thank you for your time. Oh, still, in that case, I will take just 2 minutes. Development consists of knowledge, politics, and hope, and their evolving critique, renewal, and transformation. Yoga and Tantra of development helps us to interrogate their formulaic construction, reconstitute these, and create new relationships among them. For example, knowledge, politics, and hope. You know, for example, hope is a very deep concern in all of these thinkers, you know. And then how do we relate hope, not just as a wishful thinking, but to knowledge and politics of a different kind. And the whole yoga and tantra of development is a fundamental critique of the dominant political theology, where the very notion of the politics is to find an enemy. But political theology, cultivated by scholars like Carl Smith, who had a Nazi connection, and that is the dominant idea of politics, which still governs us. We need to develop a yoga and tantra of our relations where it is not to find enemy, but the so-called enemies also are waiting for our yoga of friendship. Thank you for your kind attention.